Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Mike Hayward, and on behalf of the Office of Cybersecurity and Information Assurance and the Chamber of Commerce's Data Protection Forum, we're pleased to be able to host the webinar today. We're grateful to Scott Salmons from the Channel Islands and Isle of Man group of the Information and Records Management Society for agreeing to provide the topic and the speaker. Judging by the number of attendees today, it's definitely struck a chord, and we're delighted that so many of you have joined us today. Hopefully you will notice that we've turned off your cameras and sound, but if you want to ask any questions during the webinar, please do use the Q&A option at the top of the screen. And we're also looking to record today's webinar so that we can share it with anybody who hasn't been able to attend. So if you're not happy to be recorded, please maybe leave the call. I'm now going to hand over to Scott, who'll say a few words before we hear from today's main speaker, which is Rob Bath.
Thanks, Mike. Welcome one and all, and welcome to this, hopefully one of the first webinar type events that we're going to do, building on the first, or one of the first face-to-face events we ran on the island in February of last year. So one of the topics that came up in our face-to-face event that we did in February last year over in the iMuseum in Douglas was around technologies and other such things, including the glorious Microsoft 365. Therefore, we wanted to do a little taster session to take you through what some of the basics operations of, and hopefully then lead on to a further discussion around some other things that affect how we manage our information and records in 365 and others as well that we're going to look at hopefully at a future event in the future as well. So quick little sales plug from me for those of you that haven't heard of the Information and Records Management Society and the Islands Data Governance Forum. Do take a look at irms.org.uk/Islands Data Forum. The Information and Records Management Society is a professional membership organisation that runs a series of events, courses, other such bits and pieces for you as an information and records management professional, including DPOs and other. And the Islands Data Governance Forum has been set up relatively recently by myself and a few others, looking at networking, specifically networking. So the forum is free to join, and is looking at running networking events and other such things across all of the Crown Dependency Islands, plus islands like the Falkland Islands, Gibraltar, and further afield. So if it is something you might be interested in coming along to and getting involved in, as well as something specific on the Isle of Man with the Society, then do head to the website on the screen at the moment or in the chat and find out more. So that's it from me. Don't want to eat into your time learning more about Microsoft 365. So please give a very warm welcome to Rob Bath from Intelogy, who's going to take us through a few things, maybe answer some of our profound questions, or maybe not. We'll see how we go. But please give a very big warm welcome to Rob. Rob, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Scott. Very kind of you to invite me. So today we're talking about why you should be worried about Microsoft 365. Or at least that's the title in terms of what I've been asked to speak around. Very kind to have been invited by both parties here to be able to discuss, I guess, an overview of Microsoft 365 to try and give you an outline of what's available inside the platform, both for people who are relatively new to Microsoft 365 or perhaps haven't taken the plunge at all and are looking at it from the outside perspective, and also perhaps to try and reinforce a sort of understanding across the platform for people who are already inside Microsoft 365. So I'm hoping that wherever you are in your Microsoft 365 journey, that there's something in today's session that will be of use to you. And specifically what I want to be looking at is trying to think about some of the potential concerns that people across the data protection and information governance community might well have around Microsoft 365. So Do at any stage feel free to use the Q&A function to try and ask questions. I can't monitor them while I'm speaking. Unfortunately, I don't have enough monitors to keep everything up in front of me, but certainly at the end of the session, if we've got enough time, I'll try and run through all of those questions to make sure that we can go into as much detail as you want to around any of the stages. So even though this is a fairly high level conversation that's going to be sort of going broad rather than deep, feel free to ask me deep questions if you want to around any of these capabilities. So who am I? Well, I'm sure most of you are bored sick of this slide already, but for those of you who don't know me, I'm a Microsoft 365 solution architect, and I also happen to be the Information and Records Management Society's Digital Director. I try and have almost one foot in both the IT camp and another foot in the information governance camp, if you like. So over the last 7 or 8 years, I've overseen many of the largest records management solutions inside Microsoft 365 for central government here in the UK, as well as for, say, county councils, universities, etc., right around predominantly across the UK. Anyway, do feel free to get in touch if you want to. Many of you probably already do, but I'm happy to try and answer any questions, steer you in the right direction, point you towards resources, etc. So feel free to note down my contact details and get in touch if you do have any questions. So, should you be worried? It's not an easy question. I mean, I think it depends on where you are. I mean, if you are thinking about Microsoft 365 and you just jump into it, you don't completely off the shelf, vanilla, the way that Microsoft gives it to you, you probably should be a little bit worried because, you know, some of the capabilities that you've got access to are incredibly empowering. They're really rich and powerful tools that end users find genuinely quite intuitive to pick up and run with. But without any form of governance controls in place, without thinking about the architectures that you're putting in place across the whole tenant and the policies and the guidance you're giving out to staff across your organization, I think you probably should be a little bit worried because you're going to end up with incredibly easy to use, very flexible team working solutions, but you're also going to end up with information being stored in lots of different locations without any real context or understanding of the value or purpose of that information. You're also going to end up with perhaps different ways of using different parts of the Microsoft 365 platform being adopted by different teams inside your organization. So I personally think, should you be worried? Not really, but should you be worried if if you haven't thought about governance and you've just jumped in? Probably, yeah. But don't worry, it's not too late. Whichever situation you're in, it's never too late to start applying the governance controls and starting to think about how you can tidy things up. But certainly if you haven't taken the plunge already, do make sure that governance and data protection is at the forefront of your planning around the Microsoft 365 adoption. So let me just give you an analogy on what Microsoft 365 looks like if you don't do any form of governance. Now, I can't do this across the whole tenant, but you can almost take this as an example. I'm going to use Microsoft Teams in this example, but you could almost say the same thing for, say, Stream, or say the same thing for any of the other capabilities across Microsoft 365. You're going to get into a little bit of a mess. So out of the box in Microsoft Teams, without any governance, any member of staff, any user can create a team. And what you get behind Microsoft Teams is the ability, each team comes with a SharePoint site. In fact, as many of you will know, a team now can have more than one SharePoint site. I actually had to look it up before this session just to try and work out how many SharePoint sites in theory can be behind a single team. Well, every private channel that is created inside a team is allowed, spins up a separate site, and every shared channel that's behind a team spins up a separate site. And the maximum limit, so theoretical maximum number of SharePoint sites that could be behind a single team now, 30 for private channels and another 200 for shared channels, bringing the total to 231 sites for every for every team, potentially. You can imagine how confusing this can get from a governance perspective. But anyhow, across your organization, you're going to have different parts of the organization, different departments owning different information. You're going to have situations where when you're looking at it from a helicopter view, you can almost imagine that it's a very confusing array of different workspaces. All the names that are being given to these out of the box are fully determined by the user that's creating it in the first place. So it's very difficult often to identify any which of these teams, which of these sites contain information of value to the organization, what the purpose of each is. You can certainly look at things as to whether it's still being used and see how many people are actively sort of storing content in there and the volumes of information that happen to be in there, potentially start deleting down things behind the scenes. But the do nothing approach in Microsoft 365 will quickly lead you to it depends on the size of the organization, but dozens, maybe hundreds, certainly in many cases for the organizations I work in, already thousands of teams and SharePoint sites. And if you haven't started thinking about the controlling of the governance as part of your core architecture, very often this becomes an absolutely almighty digital heap filled with information that at some point you're probably going to have to start thinking about wading through and understanding. So getting ahead of the curve and applying governance, I think, is critical. Otherwise, you end up with an architecture a bit like this. Now, I'm not going to read through all of this list, but these are some of the situations you quickly get yourself into if you don't apply any form of governance in Microsoft Teams or in SharePoint. And the longer you don't do anything about controlling this, you can imagine the problems are just going to get worse and worse. So should you be worried? Well, maybe in some situations. Get ahead of the governance. I don't think you need to be worried. Now, I don't know how many people in this call have already taken the plunge into Microsoft 365. I'd imagine it's going to vary depending upon the audience that's on the call, but I think most organizations, certainly in the UK now, have at least some presence in Microsoft 365 and are some way down that Microsoft 365 journey. But there might be many of you on this call that haven't moved at all. Perhaps you're using alternative platforms. Perhaps you're still thinking about the initial sort of move into Microsoft 365. So I think you'll all be in slightly different positions. But as an overview, I'm not going to take credit for this slide, by the way. This is done by I'm pointing to the side because it's on my big screen to my side, by the way, just in case you think I'm pointing in a strange direction. But this is a periodic table of Microsoft 365 that has been put together by an MVP, a Microsoft MVP called Matt Wade. So I'm not going to take any credit for this whatsoever, but Matt has put together this particular periodic table of Microsoft 365, which I find a really interesting way of getting a flavor for the complexity and different use cases that you've got across Microsoft 365. So what we've got here is a complex and rich platform. It's an ever-changing platform with lots of different diverse workloads. And when Microsoft first started pulling together what was then Office 365 into a shared platform, what they really did is they started taking some of their existing tools. You're familiar with many of them, like the Office suite, Excel, Word, etc. They pulled many of these existing tools together under the shared single login that Microsoft 365 provides. But over time, they've also started more heavily integrating these tools. You'll notice, for example, that you can share content directly from inside, say, the Word client now. And this is these capabilities that are being almost extended from one part of the platform to another. So they're slowly becoming more and more integrated with each other. But let's take a look at some of the core areas of Microsoft 365 that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but many of you will need to be focusing on, because not all of these different workloads are going to be critically the thing that you are focusing on as an information governance professional. You're going to want to drill into the certain areas and spend more of your time on some of these workloads over others. Now, the first one that I think we're all very familiar with is Outlook and Exchange, the ability to share emails. It's going to be a critical part, I think, of your decision making across the tenant. Different people are going to want to manage emails in different ways. Some will just let email get out of control by itself in the corner. Others will want to make sure that there's an automated deletion process going on to try and discourage people from using it as a place where they're storing information and try and prevent things getting too bloated and too large. Some will want to apply retention to the mail content, perhaps in situ, because Microsoft 365 allows you to treat Outlook almost as its own records management solution now. You can start managing things as records inside Outlook itself. Others will want to have processes that extract emails and perhaps store them elsewhere where they're managed. So different situations, different scenarios, but you certainly will want to be looking at Outlook as one of the key tools in Microsoft 365 to get on top of. Next, you've got various different parts of Microsoft 365 that allow you to store unstructured information. And this, I think, is probably maybe above my Outlook when it comes to your thinking as a governance professional. You're certainly going to be wanting to think about how you allow people to store information in, say, OneDrive, SharePoint, and Teams, and what balance you're going to have between the three. Now, I'll come on to Teams and SharePoint more in the next few slides, but certainly OneDrive, I think, is a very interesting one, because if you do nothing, then it becomes almost a very easy place for people to store their content. It's a personal space. It's designed for, you know, every member of staff to have their own personal OneDrive where their content is stored. But it's very easy for that to quickly grow into almost its own business application, where certain members of staff might be storing vast amounts of information inside OneDrive and sharing it with multiple other people and almost using it as a collaboration space. In theory, you could also share content from OneDrive externally. So you can imagine how it could become a space that's containing a huge amount of highly important information for the organization. The problem is when the user leaves the organization, by default, it's deleted down. So the OneDrive and all of that content will go. And let's face it, who's got time, even if you don't do that and you want to keep it and manually review it, who's got time to sit there and wade through somebody else's structure of folders to try and find content to work out whether it's got any value for the wider organization? Invariably, some organizations do choose to keep OneDrive, but I'm not sure many people have the time to effectively manage them down and find that content of value. So for me, the best solution for OneDrive is to start thinking about discouraging its use as a collaboration space and encouraging people to store content in other parts of Microsoft 365 instead. But different organizations will have different priorities. It's worth being very aware of Microsoft Stream. I won't go into any real details here, but this is like an internal YouTube. And you can imagine if you are storing lots of videos for internal use, you're probably going to want to start using some of the governance that's provided across Stream. That said, at this stage, it's fairly limited across Microsoft Stream in terms of what you can do to control the life cycle, if you like, of your videos. But it's certainly something that you should probably be looking at. You've also got lists and Dataverse. These are spaces where you can start storing your structured information. They're not databases, but they're almost moving in that direction to a certain extent. And as you can probably imagine, many lighter applications can be built inside Microsoft 365, such as, I don't know, your purchase order system or your travel request system. And you could quite easily build solutions like this that are storing information that you absolutely need to think about as a governance professional. For example, imagine you have a list of, I don't know, external contacts or stakeholders. You're probably going to want to make sure that they're kept in accordance with GDPR. So I'd certainly, you do not want to exclude these from your broader strategy for Microsoft 365. And last, you've also got the Power Platform, which is an incredibly powerful set of tools for capturing information and running business processes throughout the organization. These, while they don't tend to store information per se, because they're moving information that they capture into, say, the lists or Dataverse that we saw before. The Power Platform is something that you probably want to make sure that you're thinking about in terms of its longer term maintenance for the organization. Certainly, it can, because it's a development platform, if you like, that everyone is encouraged to use. So you will find Power Apps and Power Automate processes appearing in different parts of some organizations when they've got perhaps someone enthusiastic to give it a go. But making sure that those are maintainable and sustainable is something that I think is on the fringes of what we all want to look at as governance professionals, but certainly not one to overlook. And I'm not going to dive into the rest of these. Some of these capabilities like Viva and Syntax require additional licensing. But you might be lucky enough to see some of these in your tenant if you happen to have the additional licenses. Anyway, happy to answer questions right across the whole of this set suite if useful. So really quick dive into SharePoint. You all know roughly what SharePoint is. I mean, over the years, it's more than 20 years old. It's predominantly a space for storing unstructured information. You know, it's come from a space where you store your documents, and many people will have seen SharePoint over the years as a document management solution that's slowly evolved. It's had a bit of an unfair reputation, I think, over the years for being clunky and unuser-friendly. Certainly, many people, when they hear the word SharePoint, start to groan. I think it's a lot more usable than it's ever been before. It's fairly intuitive now. It's fairly simple to start customizing and making it look a lot more effective. And it's certainly a lot cheaper to do this. Gone are the days when there were very large-scale sort of branding projects in SharePoint. You know, we've moved from that to a far more consistent and easy approach where you just drag and drop your content into the right space, and so long as your navigation is intuitive, it's pretty easy to use. SharePoint, I guess it has a structure that you probably should all be familiar with. The best analogy I've got is it's almost like Russian dolls, if you like, where you've got one SharePoint Online tenant, you know, instance, and inside that you can have up to 2,000 hubs. I don't know anyone who's got anywhere close to 2,000 hubs. I'll come on to hubs in a bit more detail in a second, but the best way of thinking about them is as a separate application. So you have a hub, say, for your intranet, and a hub for, say, your document management, if you're choosing to go down that route. Inside your hubs, or maybe completely outside of your hubs, you can have a whole bunch of different SharePoint sites. It varies how many you have by organization, but you'll probably have hundreds of them. And in most organizations, thousands or even tens of thousands of separate SharePoint sites now. And each site will contain lists and libraries, and it's inside those lists and libraries that you're storing your content. And you might have folders inside them as well, but it's those lists and libraries where metadata gets applied to the items. I'm not going to go more complicated than that at this stage, but I will just look at the hub model quickly. So I'm sure when many of you think about the hierarchy of SharePoint, you think about something that looks a bit like this. This actually isn't the hierarchy that we use anymore. You see, if we were talking 10 years ago, yes, we would have a structure that's a bit like this, where there's a single site, or we used to call them site collections, or only a handful, perhaps, for large organizations, 4 or 5. Containing large structures of subsites. But we've moved away from this. I haven't personally added a subsite into any of the architectures I've given to any of my clients since 2014. So they're long gone. And if you are using a hierarchy that looks like this, that contains subsites already, I would strongly urge you to, it's time to revamp. I'm not saying Microsoft's going to pull the plug on subsites, but it wouldn't surprise me, because it's very clear over the last 7 or 8 years that Microsoft have moved heavily away from subsites and are not really supporting them going forwards. Instead, the site itself has become the main place that we're storing content, and you have a lot more of them than you used to 10 years ago. So you've got a much flatter architecture of multiple sites, each storing different parts of your information. And where a site before might have well been, I've certainly seen it in some organizations, all of your document management system in a single site, you're now very much having dozens of sites representing, say, just a single department, or a single site for a project, for example, or even more than one site for a project. So the architectures have become much flatter, with more sites being used. And this is where the hubs come in, because of course the hubs allow us to have a structure that pulls together some of those sites into what I was loosely referring to as applications, but different people use hubs in different ways. You might well have a single application that uses multiple hubs, for example. And this means that across your tenant, you will have a series of hubs that, if you're using hubs at all, you should end up with a series of hubs, each representing different types of work, you know, different applications that you're using, intranets, document management systems, etc. And just at a very high level, what do you actually get with a hub? Well, you end up with a consistent branding. You set the color scheme at the top of the hub and it cascades down. But more importantly, you end up with consistent search. So if you search on the hub homepage, you're bringing back content from across the breadth of that hub in any of the sites that are associated with that hub, but you're not bringing back content from outside of the hub. You're also able to get consistent top navigation. So you can set your top navigation across the whole breadth of the hub, and all of the sites that are associated with that hub will share the same top navigation. So a really powerful little tool to be aware of. Let's move on quickly to Teams, because we've got lots of different areas to cover, and again, only shallow depth. But in Microsoft Teams, well, a team, I think the best way of viewing it is almost using this wormhole or portal analogy. I mean, a team really has become your shop window into Microsoft 365. And I'm sure many of you are very familiar with Teams and use it on a regular basis, but it's slowly become that first place of working. Both, you know, it's combines both the communication capabilities of Microsoft 365, your ability to make calls and have instant conversations with people across the organization and outside as well. But it's also the collaboration space where you can get teams of people working together and storing content and you know, having shared conversations around that content. Now, very high level again, but I just wanted to try and show you that Teams originally really had three building blocks, if you like. It had Outlook integration, so it had the ability to schedule meetings, but it also had a lot coming from Skype for Business. Now, Skype for Business, as many of you will know, is no longer with us. It's been deprecated, but what you had was legacy capabilities around instant messaging and video conferencing, etc., that came over from Skype for Business and now has fully been replaced by Teams itself. So this is the only set of functionality that I think you should probably consider as being in Teams. Almost everything else outside of the communication capabilities is being surfaced from a different application. A great example is SharePoint. Every time you spin up a team, there's a SharePoint site underpinning it. And the files that you're seeing surfaced in Microsoft Teams are mostly coming from SharePoint. Some of them might be coming from OneDrive as well. And this team space, you notice how I've given it dual color. This is because it's slightly more complicated than some of the other areas. The team space inside Microsoft Teams is where you create teams. I wish there were different names for this. Unfortunately, you know, it's lots of the word teams over and over again. But each team is a locked down group of individuals who have access to a shared set of resources. So it's all based upon the Microsoft 365 group model. You've got a group of people. It could be, you know, a handful of people, or it could be a lot of people, are all given access as members of a team, and they've all got the ability to add, edit, and delete content in that team. And that content is typically posts that are coming, being stored in Teams. Well, we can get into the details around the storage if you'd like to go that way, but files as well are being stored in the associated SharePoint site, or as we saw before, potentially up to 230 odd SharePoint sites underpinning each team. But you can see how it's surfacing different information. Over the last couple of years, we've had Yammer introduced, so Yammer communities are now available inside Teams. You can start seeing information coming from Yammer. But there's also a whole wealth of other spaces, from OneDrive to Power Apps to Power BI, where now we're starting to be able to surface information in the single Microsoft Teams client that's actually coming from different locations. Power Apps are really important here from my perspective, because it allows you to extend Teams with your own custom processes. For example, if I book leave at work here in Intelogy, we've got a custom Power App that I go to book leave, and it's stored within Microsoft Teams. Certainly the little icon towards the end here, that I've never seen it before, this putting together this slide deck, the little blue dot on the end. This sort of person looking icon is actually the Viva Suite icon. And for those of you who are lucky enough to have Viva licenses, there's a whole wealth of different capabilities that are extended into the Teams client around things such as training and insights, for example, around how you're personally working. But all of you should have access to certain parts of Viva for free, including Viva Connections, which allows you to show your SharePoint-based intranet directly inside Microsoft Teams. So you can probably imagine it's a complicated beast, Microsoft Teams. It's surfacing lots of different information. Now, from a governance perspective, you've got to be thinking not really just about applying governance to teams. You've got to be thinking about the governance that's applied to wherever the content is actually being pulled from. So you're really thinking about, well, how do I apply governance to, say, the content that's in SharePoint and Yammer and different parts of Microsoft 365 tenant. So I hope this gives you an impression of almost when you're thinking about, when you're planning your strategy for information governance across the whole platform, you've got to be thinking about different parts of the platform, how you want people to use it, and what sort of levels of, say, retention or sensitivity you want to apply to that content. So very quick explanation of some of the key models that perhaps we see people using. You're going to have to make decisions like this across different parts of Microsoft 365. I mean, you could just open it up and it becomes a bit of a free-for-all, but I would strongly encourage you to start thinking wherever you are in your Microsoft 365 journey about conversations like this in terms of how are we going to get the most out of Microsoft 365? What approach is going to work best for us? And in this approach, I just wanted to show you that one of the early decisions that almost every organization needs to make is the balance between SharePoint and Teams that they want to use. Now, certainly, I'm currently working with organizations that have decided to go with all three of these different approaches. So I think there's still a valid conversation to be had here about, what is it that you are trying to achieve and how do you want to get the best out of the technology? Let me explain. SharePoint only. One approach, I don't see it that often anymore, but one approach that people want to consider is to have a static structure of SharePoint sites, very often a fixed hierarchy that represents your file plan in some scenarios, has default metadata, perhaps it has default retention for your records management, so that wherever you store your content, effectively it's going to be automatically governed. Makes a lot of sense in many scenarios. It's relatively easy to set up. Sure, you need a development project of some description, and it's fairly easy to apply the governance. I mean, once it's there, it's controlled, if you like. However, I think if you go down this approach, you're going to get increasing amounts of pushback from staff, especially staff who have used Teams in other organizations. As soon as you've seen and used Teams, it's for most people quite an intuitive experience, and certainly some of the negatives of SharePoint being controlled and locked down, I think you might get a lot of pushback if this is your direction. Instead, other people are considering a Teams-only approach, which is incredibly intuitive and collaborative, where people can spin up new teams for different spaces. Of course, as we saw in my example before, it's going to get you into a mess if that's entirely what you're doing. You probably, with a Teams-only approach, of course, you're still storing files inside SharePoint because there's still the SharePoint site behind the scenes. What I mean by a Teams-only approach is that you're not using standalone SharePoint sites as a rigid hierarchy. You're more focusing upon the ability to spin up new teams and storing all of your content in those workspaces. Now, it is really quite easy for most end users to use Teams and to store content, although I think there is a point of perhaps saturation where once you've got, 30 or 40 teams in your left-hand navigation and you're starting to scroll through it, it can be quite confusing to work out who mentioned you in which conversation and where a specific file was stored. So I'm not saying it's incredibly intuitive, but it's certainly most users that I've spoken to seem to prefer the Teams using Teams as an interface than using SharePoint. One of the big problems I've got with the Teams approach is whether you're using public teams or private teams, you're effectively creating information silos. Only the members of the team have access to the information inside the team. And even if it's a public team, which means that members can invite themselves, people can invite themselves in as a member, if you like, without needing approval. A public, even in that scenario, if you're not inside the team, you can't see the content inside the team, so you don't know that you need to be inside the team because you don't know which content you want to see in each team. So one of the things we want to avoid is the creation of information silos, and unfortunately Teams does encourage lots of different silos of information, which leads to all manner of issues, as you can imagine, like content duplication and a lack of trust in the validity of different information that people are seeing. And the other thing to think about Microsoft Teams is because it's fluid, because it's ever changing, because people are requesting new teams and being able to create new channels all the time, you need to have, in most scenarios, some form of process around the application of governance. So every time a team is set up, you're going to need to think about how do we apply the right retention labels to it, or how do we extend the right content types and metadata that we want people to classify their content with. And setting this up for most organizations, given the sort of volume of new teams that are created quite often, you'll find yourself in a situation where it's just too much to try and attempt this manually. And many organizations need to start thinking about automated approaches to sort of applying the governance to their team structures. Now, the hybrid approach is probably the most common. You know, very few people are at the extremes of I'm only using Teams, or I'm only using SharePoint. Most people are probably in this mixed bag where there's a little bit of SharePoint for some reasons and there's a little bit of Teams for other purposes. And very often with hybrid approaches, what you'll find is there'll be things like projects are conducted inside Microsoft Teams. Sometimes perhaps departmental work being conducted inside Microsoft Teams, but very often, say, you'll have some form of knowledge base, maybe a records management hub or something similar inside a static structure, perhaps a file pan structure inside SharePoint. And very often there'll be a transfer of content from one to the other. So perhaps a project comes to an end and part of the close down process is to identify content of value and move it across into a functional hierarchy in SharePoint. Now, you get a lot of benefits of this approach because you almost get the best of both worlds to a certain extent, but it's certainly not without its drawbacks. I mean, it was confusing in Teams when we had lots of teams to try and work out which team information is stored in. As you probably realize, that a big hierarchy of SharePoint sites is only as good as the navigation that allows you to easily find content, and the search experience and the metadata that helps to improve that search experience to find that content in the first place. But the hybrid model can be even more confusing because now you're into a scenario of trying to think, well, is that file inside a team or inside a SharePoint site? I know it's inside a SharePoint site behind the team, but how do I find it? What's the best navigation route to find specific content? And of course, that transfer process, identifying content of value. If you are looking at having teams and you're thinking, I need to close this team, I need to move the content elsewhere, identifying it is very often a manual process. And very often, I think you're going to be losing content of value as part of that. So none of these is a perfect, I'm not saying any of these is the direction you should go in, but you need to understand the pros and cons for yourself and devise which of these is going to be most appropriate for you and your organization. And the similar sort of thinking will need to be happening again and again and again across Microsoft 365 for different workloads that you're going to be carrying about in terms of the functionality. So I want to try and also give you a loose introduction to Microsoft Purview. Now, Microsoft Purview's a rebranding of the old Microsoft Compliance Center, and it's really the control panel for governance across your tenant. It's a space where very often it's owned by the IT team or by a third party managing your tenant on your behalf, but really I think anyone who's working in data protection or in governance in any regard, I think it's really those individuals who should be the authority of ownership, at least, maybe not execution, but really the functionality that's contained inside Purview should be in your hands to control. Now, some of the functionality clearly leans towards other spaces and other people like information security, but it's still, I think, the majority of what you're getting inside Microsoft Purview is within the remit of an information management or information governance professional to oversee. So what is it? Well, these are not Microsoft's definitions of the way that they've decided to divide Microsoft Purview. It's a lot more confusing than this, but these are my attempt to try and simplify what you're actually getting inside Microsoft Purview. So what you've got is, underneath what I've called the information protection areas, you've got capabilities that are more leaning towards information security, but you've got the ability to try and prevent information that you have from falling into the wrong hands. perhaps internally from, certain types of information just can't be passed from one team to another, or more likely externally. So you're identifying that information that just can't be shared externally at all. Or if it is with sensitivity labels, that your controls persist with that information, so that even when it's left your tenant altogether and someone else has opened up that particular piece of information on their own desktop or laptop, that your controls still persist with it, so that perhaps they can't forward the email or download and print. You get the idea. There's various different things in the audit and monitoring space that I think people should be aware of too. The tenant-wide audit log is stored inside Microsoft Purview, and this gives a blanket coverage of almost, pretty much everything that's going on in your tenant. You can see in the audit every time a file's been opened, by whom, at what time, every time a folder's been deleted, every time virtually anything happens, it's available in that audit log. As you can probably imagine, there's going to be lots of use case for people in certainly triaging IT support issues coming into the audit log to monitor things. And probably less important from a governance perspective, but certainly you need to know it exists, and you probably want to make sure that it's only accessed by people who absolutely have a need to access this sort of information, because it's showing a lot of information inside that space. But there's also various reports, so you can overview, usage across the tenant, especially when you're talking about, say, application of retention or application of sensitivity across the tenancy. Gives you high-level reports in that space too. On the governance perspective, there's a wealth of different tools that you should be aware of. You've got the ability to facilitate information requests, so data subject requests, subject access requests, etc. There's different ways of doing this in Microsoft 365. Microsoft Purview provides you with content search, which has been there for a few years now and allows you to almost find information from right across the tenant in anyone's inbox, in anyone's OneDrive, for example, and pulls it all together into an exportable, so that it's easy to export. One of the problems that you might find with this sort of process is that perhaps it gives you a little bit too much information. So very often in the past, where it's almost been a best endeavors approach to trying to find information that facilitates the request, you might find a few dozen or maybe a few hundred bits of information that happen to meet the definition of whatever the request happens to be. You might be in a different situation once you're using tools such as content search to find that information, because certainly when I've done it in the past, you're often seeing tens of thousands of results, and your problem is trying to reduce that set to a more manageable export that still adheres to what you're being asked to provide. There's other ways of doing this as well, by the way. It's not just content search. You've also got, if you're lucky enough to have Microsoft Priva licenses, there's licensing everywhere in Microsoft 365. Unfortunately, there's thousands of separate licenses as far as I can. I don't think that's an exaggeration. I don't actually know the number of different licenses that are around, but there's licenses for everything. But if you're lucky enough to have Microsoft Priva licenses, there is a more sort of advanced method of undertaking data subject requests in there as well. Records management. All of the records management capabilities inside Microsoft 365 can be found inside the Microsoft Purview. And the main ones that you should be aware of are the retention label, which I'm sure many of you are very aware of, which is the ability to apply almost a tag against each individual item, each file, each email, and represent how long it needs to be kept for by the organization, or automate deletion at the end of the retention period, for example. Or if you happen to have advanced licenses, there's a whole bunch of things you could do around disposition reviews and starting custom processes at the end of retention. You've also got the retention policy, which is much more of a broad brush approach. It allows you to mark all of the content in a given area as being having the same retention duration, so it's much easier to set up. That said, when users click delete, content is caught and held behind the scenes in a hidden bucket, and unfortunately once it's in that bucket, it's kept there for the remainder of its retention period. So this means that if you are deleting something with a retention policy that is something that you no longer have the legal right to retain, so let's say it's a right to be forgotten, for example, under GDPR, and you hit delete on the file with a retention policy, unfortunately there's no way of preventing it. That will automatically land in the hidden location behind the scenes, and once it's in there, you can imagine that you're forced to keep it. There's nothing you can do, you can't delete it, and it will still be content that you possess that will still need to be provided as part of a subject access request, for example. So be careful. I've obviously spoken a lot about records management in the past in a lot more detail, but it's something to be very aware of. There's also e-discovery capabilities if you're subject to, say, an inquiry or need to apply legal holds across information, perhaps for a court case. And last, I won't go into much detail here, but there's a whole bunch of internal risk capabilities to start monitoring activity like suspicious behavior. Perhaps someone's just quit the organization and is suddenly downloading a vast amount of information. Or you can start almost snooping on conversations that are going on to monitor against certainly get alerted every time someone uses certain profanities, for example, or certain words that they shouldn't be using in certain conversations. No, I personally find this slightly intrusive, and I can see certain value in many organizations for setting up some of these internal risk controls, but it's probably not first and foremost in many of your initial thinking around how to configure Microsoft Purview. That said, very powerful tools. Now, obviously, I've gone very skin deep around some of those capabilities, especially retention today, but should you be worried? Well, maybe. I think if you're not doing anything, if you haven't really, if let's say, like many organizations, there was the mad rush into Microsoft Teams to support working from home, and you're in a situation where there are thousands of teams or hundreds of teams across the organization where there's limited governance or no real governance being applied, then I wouldn't say worried is the right word, but you should certainly be thinking about how to retrospectively apply governance and controls over that information. But certainly it's not too late is the message, I think. But for anyone who's planning this stage, should you be worried? Well, make sure you get to the front of the conversation inside your organization. Make sure that one of the absolute key requirements alongside usability and collaboration is governance, that you're at the forefront of those requirements when you're pushing out the control of how you use the tenant. In fact, I would argue that the whole tenant and the whole of its architecture should really be in your hands and not left to IT or third-party agencies to oversee. So please feel free to ask any questions you've got. I recognise we've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to have a quick look and see what questions we have.
There's 2 in the Q&A area at the moment. If anyone's got any more, plot them in the Q&A area, or if you don't have access to that, plot them in the chat.
Absolutely, and do feel free to reach out at any stage with questions. So I'll start at the top. Okay, is there a place where someone can see what comes with each license so people can find out what they might have? Oh gosh, the licensing side of Microsoft 365 is one of the most confusing parts of Microsoft 365. Just suddenly realised we've got light coming through this window. It looks like I'm in a prison cell or something. But I haven't been able to see my face or anyone else on stage or any questions while I've had the presentation up. But yeah, the licensing is a really confusing story if you ask me. There's licenses for everything. There are dozens and dozens of licenses. I genuinely don't know how many. But just on compliance, there are certainly compliance specific licenses to be aware of. So you get certain amounts with your base licenses. Each user will be given a basic license. And when I say basic, there's a whole array of different licenses that can be provided there. And then very often you'll have bolt-on or additional licenses in specific places. So Is there a single place? Well, it might, certainly on the compliance side of things, there is a good resource that Microsoft provides that if I can dig it out, I will share the link with everyone, because certainly the compliance team have put together quite a, it's a bit comprehensive, if you like, but quite a comprehensive list of which licenses you need to be able to use certain functions. But I've not seen a brilliant resource that goes right across the breadth of Microsoft 365, unfortunately. There's just too many licenses. Did see a few months ago someone had tried to put it into a diagram, and it was an incredibly complicated diagram with just a sea of separate licenses covering different things. So I wouldn't share that as an official source, shall we say. But if I have time, I'll try and dig this up after this call and post it into the chat so that everyone can see the link to the licensing for the compliance licenses at least. With the tools built in across the platform, should you be more worried if an organization isn't considering Microsoft 365 over more traditional on-premise data stores tools? Should you be more worried if an organization isn't? Because that's an interesting question. It depends what you're trying to achieve. I wouldn't be more worried about using a different tools. Obviously, you know, if the tool is a system of record, then it needs to be properly assessed. You need to undertake a compliance assessment against any tool, and you need to be coming up with a strategy. And it's certainly, I think, many organizations, once they take the plunge into Microsoft 365, see it as a good opportunity to get rid of a whole raft of different isolated bits of technology that are perhaps not talking to each other very well and being used for disparate purposes. So they can ditch, perhaps, you know, in many cases, the telephones that are on everyone's desks, and they can ditch the standalone records management system and move entirely into the platform so that they're consolidating everything in that one space. But should you exclusively use that platform? It's up to you. I mean, there may be certain parts of what you're doing as an organization that really demands a higher level of compliance in some regard, or perhaps a better level of telephony. You know, Microsoft 365 almost provides you with a huge amount of capabilities, but you certainly will find niche software vendors that are ahead of the curve and have additional functionality that Microsoft haven't yet built in or got around to. So I wouldn't be more worried one way or another. I think you need to select the blend of capabilities that's most appropriate to you and your organization. That said, Microsoft 365 is probably a good starting point to provide you with the blanket of most of these capabilities. You can see there's a couple of more questions that come in. So, is it too simplistic to say Microsoft 365 will be replacing Microsoft Office, and is that accurate? I think Microsoft would get a huge pushback if if they try to abandon standalone Office. Many organizations still want to not be forced to adopt Microsoft 365. Microsoft are obviously making it as attractive as they can to try and encourage people in that direction. I doubt they'll ever abandon Office as a standalone technology, though. And the reason I say that is I think there are certainly people who work in certain industries, especially say defense, where it's just too big a hop. The nature of the information that they're processing is just too sensitive to consider Microsoft 365, and they need to work on their own standalone environment. So I can't foresee a situation where Office will be discontinued. But I would say for most organizations, yeah, Microsoft 365 is probably the logical starting place as a route into Office now. Hope that answered the question. So next question, is Office 365 able to integrate with other records management programs, for example, Laserfish? Would Purview be able to return searches for items within Laserfish? Well, I'm not a Laserfish expert, so I don't know enough about Laserfish to be able to fully answer the question, but certainly, yes, as a broad principle, Microsoft 365 can interface with lots of different other applications. You can build your own connectors to start including other applications inside the search of Microsoft 365, and you can even start extending some of the governance capabilities out to other applications. But it's really on the vendors of those other applications as to how much they support what Microsoft's providing. One of the reasons Microsoft changed its name over to Purview, away from the Compliance Center, is really, I think, represents Microsoft's ambition to extend the governance controls they're providing in Microsoft Purview, not just across the whole of Microsoft 365, which, let's face it, there's still gaps in how far those governance controls extend within the platform at the moment. But I think their ambition is to go a lot broader. It wouldn't surprise me if over coming years we started seeing retention labels, say, springing up inside third-party applications. Maybe, I don't know, Microsoft Dynamics is a clear starting point, but I'm also thinking about databases like SQL Server, Oracle, maybe competitors tools like Salesforce. I wouldn't be surprised to see them integrated. So I can't answer for Laserfish specifically. I'd have to research that one, I'm afraid. But certainly in theory, it could be possible to integrate a third-party product and bring back content so it's searchable all as one sort of application. Next question. I am concerned that site owners do not understand clearly who they are sharing information with. We have SharePoint sites created with external sharing turned on and Microsoft Teams related to these in some cases. External users are given guest accounts in Azure AD, and these can be given access to Teams channels or SharePoint libraries or both. And it starts to become very unclear what access they have. Can you offer any advice on governance in relation to this, please? So, yeah, you're absolutely right. I wish I'd included a slide almost where I go through the evolution of SharePoint, because when it started off, it was really quite rigid and locked down, and it swung mostly because I think the competition at the time was, you know, the big lumbering ERM systems and document management systems. I'm thinking your Meridios and, you know, these big classical systems, and Microsoft really needed to build out a controlled governance sort of basis for SharePoint. And unfortunately, the downside of that was a lot of user dislike about how locked down and rigid it was. Mm-hmm. From about 2013 onwards, they started swinging clearly towards usability with the introduction of the share button and drag and drop. And while this has made it incredibly usable, and of course they were doing this to compete with a different bunch of technologies like Dropbox and Box and all these other people who are really easy to use, while this has made SharePoint and Microsoft 365 much more usable, what it has led to is, I think, some compromise in our ability to control. So it's less clear now who has access to what. So if you're, whereas in the past you could have defined, say, a permissions model for a rigid structure of SharePoint sites, fairly confident that that permission model was watertight, shall we say. Now we're in a situation where people are empowered to start sharing individual items of content with different people. So in terms of how to monitor that, well, it is a downside and it is complicated. What certainly I've been doing with some of the organizations I work with is considering whether there are any building reports, building dashboards that make it easier to see what's been shared with whom. And there's various different tools that are out there on the market that can certainly help with that interrogation process to work out how big is this mess, what information and where does it reside is being shared. But you can also, certainly I'm working with one organization who's introduced almost a monthly check process. So they're almost, as part of the responsibilities of the owners of each team, is to make sure that they're monitoring all of the content that's being shared in different spaces. And it seems so far to have been relatively successful. But you're quite right, it's certainly not perfect. You know, it certainly can't just be ignored. Sharing can get out of hand. The phrase I often use for it in modern SharePoint and Teams is permission soup, and that's something that I think we all want to avoid.
I like that. There's another question in the chat. I'll read it aloud in case you can't see it. Any thoughts on international transfers and how each app needs review, or does it?
Thoughts on international transfers? I'm not really sure I fully understand the question. There's a comment underneath it. We're concerned about this as well. Obviously, it's an interesting topic. So I'd quite like a little bit more information on precisely what you mean by an international transfer, but I'm assuming it's an exchange of data or something, or perhaps files that you're sending things between countries.
I'm going to presume that's, I'm going to wait for Giles to comment, but I'm presuming that's going to be a case of or where physically is the data sitting? So is it sat on a Microsoft server in the United States, or is it sat on a Microsoft server in the European Union, and do they all sit in a particular server farm in the European Union, or is it a spread of some sat over here, some sat over there? There's a thumbs up, so I'm taking that as validation of what I'm saying. Having dealt with this before.
So, yeah, obviously Microsoft 365 is a global entity. When you set up your tenant, you are choosing the region and in some cases almost sub-regions. Certainly if you're in government, you can choose to set your tenant up inside the UK government, say, tenant space. But you're choosing that region, and people around the world will be able to access that information. So you're trying to set it up in a space where it's optimized for that use. But I guess it's difficult to think about the international transfer process because it's such an international beast, if you like, Microsoft 365. You can access it from anywhere. You certainly need to think about the different applications, and certainly if there's specific security needs in your organization, you can do certain, you can control things a little bit more, perhaps. So, for example, about a year ago or so, I was working with a Swiss bank, and certain parts of their information they absolutely couldn't have anyone outside of Switzerland accessing. So you can set up what's called an information barrier to say, no, this isn't going outside of this geographic region. Now, I'm not sure that actually answers your question because that's blocking a transfer as opposed to facilitating a transfer, but I think I'd need to know. It sounds like a separate conversation where I think we should, happy to sit down and talk with you in more detail once I understand more about the specific need. I also see one of the comments below that is in regard to personal data transfer internationally, and I'm not sure I've got significant to add on that. Obviously, you'd have to be subject to the region's regulations wherever you're transferring information. So again, I guess it depends on the context of the information, the sensitivity of that information that's being transferred. I recognise we've actually gone slightly over time already, but there's still a couple more questions. I'm happy to hang on and answer them. Feel free to drop off if people need to get to other calls, etc.
If people do need to drop off, that's absolutely fine. Do keep an eye on the have a look at the IRMS website for future events. If you want to sign up to hear about future events, then drop us a note to Islands, spelt ISLANDS, at irms.org.uk, and we'll add you to the mailing lists. If you're a Chamber of Commerce member, you'll hear about it there as well. And do keep an eye on the IRMS website. So if you do need to dash off, jot down that email address and let us know, and we'll add you to the list. Yeah, let's have a look. What other questions are outstanding?
I'm just starting to read the next one. I'm thinking, gosh, how on earth do I answer that? But many DPIAs spin out of new use cases or third-party technologies. Based on today's themes, it appears that there could be a case to start becoming more introspective at organizational architectural levels on how data flows and is processed. Well, yeah, I'd certainly encourage a full assessment of Microsoft 365, just as you would with any other technology. And I think it's certainly, you need to be introspective about the technology. You need to be thinking about how best to roll it out, ownership and the different controls that you've got available to you, and what is actually the appropriate blend of the technology to use, and how you need to govern different parts of that tenancy, and certainly how you want to guide users to use different parts of the tenancy. But yeah, the processing of that information as well. Absolutely, I fully agree. I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
We might do a, because I've been posing a few questions in the chat, and I think there's definitely a demand for some more specific sessions. What we might do is do a specific session on like the resourcing and auditing center, but also perhaps do a session on how to tackle things like DPIAs in 365 as well. So if people do find that there is a need to, how on earth do I grapple with a DPIA for every single SharePoint site, for example, then we might do a session on that as well, because I know that's come up quite a few times.
Yeah, it's a topic of its own, and you're already getting I can see in the chat for that suggestion, Scott. So there's a future session.
I might have just opened a Pandora's box there.
So The next question is around my thoughts on the recent German decision that Microsoft 365 does not comply with data protection standards. And I wasn't aware of this decision until it's been drawn to my attention. So interesting is my first initial thoughts. But yeah, there are certainly areas, certainly if you took Microsoft 365 and took any of the, say, major standards, I would think it's not going to fully comply with a lot of different things. So, for example, recently I was asked specifically about ISO 15489, and it's a hard one because ISO 15489 isn't something you can actually tick a box and say, yes, you're compliant with that as a technology. But certainly when I started thinking about what was needed in order to be compliant with that standard, I was thinking to myself, well, it probably isn't in place. It's, there's areas, especially around, say, disposition review, where it doesn't adhere to the records management standard in that space. So it doesn't surprise me that if you're doing a DPA assessment, that it's going to fall foul, if you like, or fall short of the requirements. I think what we almost need to do is collectively try and put pressure on Microsoft to change the platform to meet the standards that we need it to meet. And in some cases, they seem more amenable to incorporating these capabilities than in others. Certainly, one of the things we've been doing with IRMS is we set up a CAB, a Customer Advisory Board relationship with Microsoft, specifically with their compliance team who oversee Purview and all of its capabilities in Redmond. And this is giving us an opportunity to really start steering and influencing some aspects of the roadmap in Microsoft Purview. And there's certainly been improvements, quite considerable improvements in my mind, to the records management capabilities that we've helped usher in over the last couple of years through that, putting Microsoft directly in touch with the information management and data protection professionals. So I think it's something that we can start influencing, and we shouldn't sit back and suffer, shall we say. Given the sort of market dominance that Microsoft seems to be growing, I think we need to put pressure on them to actually come up to the standards that where we need them to. So I know it doesn't probably fully answer your question, but trying my best. I think
it didn't surprise me with the German regulators. They take a very black and white interpretation of the law, which doesn't account for risk, and there is no, to your point, there's no perfect system. There's probably systems that the German regulator is using that is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. So it's kind of an interesting case, but I can't see the Isle of Man government or the UK government following in their footsteps.
No, certainly I think a more pragmatic approach perhaps, but very often the systems that do comply are very expensive and very niche and very often very limiting on end users, should we say. So I think that's all of the questions in the Q&A section. I'm not sure if you've missed any from the chat. But
none missed from the chat that I can see. Most of them have been thank you very muches and got to goes. No questions.
Fully understand. In which case, I guess if there's no more questions, we should probably wrap up there then.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob and Scott, for organising that. It's really been very, very helpful and useful. Thank you. And we'll speak to you again in the future, we hope.
Well, thank you for the invite.
Thanks.
Thanks all.
Cheers all.